All right, let's dive deep into African politics. We've got this document, and it's amazing. Really lays out the whole scene, coups, the whole democracy thing, even how globalization plays in.
Yeah, and it's not just dry facts. It digs into what these big figures and movements were thinking, so you get a feel for those struggles and debates, that shaped Africa's politics.
And it's been a wild ride, that's for sure. Right off the bat, what hit me was how often the military just jumps right in.
Right.
Over 200 coups since 1960, it says. That's crazy. Makes you wonder, is that even change or just a new guy in charge?
The big question, yeah. And the document breaks down how those coups went down. And sometimes it's not just grabbing power. No, they dress it up as like being all about democracy. They call them, get this, constitutional coups.
Huh? So it's like, we're taking over, but hey, it's in the Constitution.
Exactly, using the rules to break the rules.
But the document's clear. These coups, they rarely make things better. It even calls it double jeopardy for the people.
You got it. Stuck with the same problems, maybe even worse, and no voice because they shut down anyone who disagrees. The document really digs into why Africa's had so many coups.
Oh, what does it say?
Weak civilian institutions, the military's got all these built-up complaints. It's a recipe for things going boom, basically.
And it's like a disease, right? One coup works, others think, hey, we can do that too. It's this awful cycle. Makes stable democracy, like, impossible.
Yeah.
And speaking of democracy, it's a mixed bag in the document. There was that hopeful phase in the 90s, everyone going multi-party.
Right, pressure from within. And globally, things were changing after the Cold War. But we got to remember, democracy in Africa has had it rough. Early leaders, post-independence, a lot of them were like, nope, one party's better, multi-party will just stir up ethnic trouble.
Like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, the document mentions him. Big on a unified system, kind of one-party democracy. But then, boom, Soviet Union falls, everything changes.
Absolutely. Those one-party guys lost their main backer, and suddenly the West is all like democratized or else.
The document points out how aid and money got tied to changing your politics.
Yeah.
Powerful tool, but makes you think, was it real change or just to keep the cash coming in?
Good question to keep in mind.
Yeah. So how are these democracies actually doing? The document splits African regimes into 4 types, right? Full, flawed, hybrid, and then just straight up authoritarian.
And here's the kicker. Only Mauritius is a full democracy. Kind of puts things in perspective.
Wow, yeah.
Even places we think are doing well, like Botswana, South Africa, they're flawed democracies. It's tough building a system that really works.
So much more than just voting, huh? You got to build institutions that function, protect everyone's rights, make sure the system benefits everyone, not just the top dogs.
Right.
Speaking of things going wrong, the document uses the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, as an example of a transition that went off the rails completely.
DRC, man, their story's a warning. Never had real elections early on, and that led to Mobutu Sese Seko taking over. The document calls it a kleptocracy, basically, rule by thieves.
Mobutu and his buddies, they just looted the place, left everyone else poor. No wonder the DRC became like a failed state. As the document says, violence everywhere, unstable as heck.
And when everyone was jumping on the democracy train in the 90s, the DRC was supposed to be on board too. They had this big national conference to get the transition going, but Mobutu, he was a master at messing with people's heads, totally derailed it.
The document says he pitted the opposition against each other. Chaos everywhere, just to hold on to power. Tragic. A chance for change. Just gone.
Shows how fragile these transitions are. You need strong institutions, everyone respecting the law, and leaders who actually care about people, not just themselves.
It makes you wonder, can something like the African Union actually fix these deep-rooted problems? Can they bring real unity and stability to the whole continent?
The document takes us way back to the whole history of African unity, starting with the Pan-Africanist movement, guys like Kwame Nkrumah who said, Africa must unite or perish.
But even within Pan-Africanism, there were different ideas on how to do it, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The document talks about 3 main groups. Brazzaville, mostly French-speaking countries. They wanted a slow approach, start with the economy. Then you had Casablanca and Nkrumah's crew. They wanted a United States of Africa right then and there. And Monrovia was somewhere in between.
So many different ideas, but eventually they formed the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, in '63.
Right.
They had some wins, like ending colonialism outright.
Right.
But the document also points out this big flaw. They weren't allowed to meddle in other countries' business.
That's right.
It's supposed to protect everyone's sovereignty, but it also meant they couldn't do anything about coups or human rights violations.
Yeah, tied their hands when they might have needed to step in. That's a big difference with the African Union, the AU, that replaced the OAU in 2002. They can intervene if things get really bad, like genocide or huge human rights abuses.
So the thinking on African unity has evolved, but then the document throws in Muammar Gaddafi's view, and he wasn't a fan of these regional economic communities.
Oh, Gaddafi, always shaking things up. He was all about a United States of Africa, saw these regional blocs as distractions, creating little divisions instead of everyone coming together. He thought they needed to make a big, bold move, not these little steps.
Really makes you think about the long-term vision for Africa. Is it about building up these regional groups or going all in on a continent-wide thing?
Big questions.
And that leads us to globalization and what it means for Africa. The document has some warnings, talks about powerful countries and institutions basically taking over economically.
Definitely raises some red flags.
It mentions structural adjustment programs, those conditions lenders put on loans, that often force African governments to do things that hurt their own people. Is globalization a good thing, or is it just another form of colonialism?
The million-dollar question. The document highlights the downsides, how these global forces can chip away at a country's control and make it harder for African nations to decide their own future. There's this one line: a borderless world is most unlikely to be a democratic one.
Wow, that's heavy. Globalization breaks down walls, sure, but doesn't make things fair for everyone. In fact, it can make the power imbalances worse and make it harder for African nations to be independent and forge their own path.
That's the core of it, right? Understanding what's shaped Africa after colonialism, both from within and outside. The document lays out that history, the good and the bad, in Africa's fight for freedom, both political and economic.
Right.
It goes through those waves of coups happening all over after independence, mostly because of power struggles, ethnic tensions, and just civilian institutions not delivering what they promised.
Yeah.
Then there's the rise of one-party states, the argument being that it brings unity and stability, but often it just led to authoritarian rule, silencing anyone who disagreed, and power concentrated in the hands of a few.
It reminds us that going from colony to independent wasn't always smooth sailing. There were mistakes, wrong turns, and brutal regimes that really hurt their people. Yeah. But the document doesn't just focus on the bad stuff. It talks about the strength of the African people, their spirit in tough times, their drive to build a better future.
For sure. It talks about those grassroots movements that stood up to authoritarian rule, those brave activists who risked everything for freedom and justice, those everyday people who never gave up hope for a fairer and more democratic society.
It's inspiring, that belief that things can change, that even when it's dark, there's always a glimmer of hope, a spark of resistance that won't go out.
It's powerful.
Makes you realize that the fight for political change in Africa is far from over. The continent's always moving, full of energy and resilience, always striving for something better. And as we move on to the next part of this document, I hope you, the listener, will come along with us. It's a reminder that change is happening all the time, that progress is never a sure thing, and that we all have a role to play in shaping a future that truly reflects what all Africans hope for.
Absolutely. Whether we're there or watching from somewhere else, we can help build a world where everyone has a chance to live with dignity, freedom, and peace. You know, what strikes me is how the document really tackles the tough questions about democracy in Africa. It's not just some Western idea we're trying to force on them.
Right. It's more than elections and a constitution. It actually starts by, breaking down what democracy even means. Reminds us that even in ancient Greece, it wasn't this perfect system we think of.
Exactly. It was limited, lots of people left out. And the document points out, in Africa, the push for democracy often came with pressure from outside, especially back in the 90s.
So you got to wonder, how much was it coming from the people and how much was it, Western donors saying, you got to change if you want our money?
Good point. And that leads to elections, which the document says are key for democracy, but just having them isn't enough, is it?
They got to be fair. Everyone's got to have a real chance to choose their leaders. No pressure, no tricks. The document gets into all the things that can go wrong.
Right, like one party just dominates or elections don't happen regularly, so leaders can stay in power forever. And the documents dig on inclusivity. Everyone who's eligible should be able to vote easily, and their vote should actually count.
Which brings up something kind of controversial. The document mentions some people think if you don't vote, you should be punished. What do you think about that?
Tough one. Low voter turnout could mean people don't care, no faith in the system. But forcing people to vote, I don't know, maybe they won't make informed choices. It's more about making the system work so people feel like their vote matters, that it actually makes a difference.
Definitely, it's about being an active citizen, not just checking a box. And that's where a strong constitution comes in, right? The document really emphasizes that, like it's the foundation of a working democracy.
It's the bedrock, yeah, laying out how to limit the government's power, what rights citizens have, sets the rules of the game, so to speak, provides stability and protects freedoms.
Each country's constitution is unique, reflecting their history and values, which is fascinating. The document talks about liberal democracy, that Western model, but it says just copying those structures doesn't mean it'll work.
You need to actually believe in those democratic values, respect everyone's rights, and be open to debate, even when it's tough.
It's got to be part of the culture, not just the laws. Speaking of outside influences, the document dives into how global events shaped that big push for democracy in Africa, late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, yeah. The end of the Cold War was huge. A lot of those one-party regimes in Africa lost support from the Soviet Union, opened the door for change. And the West, they saw their chance, started pushing for reforms, often tying aid to political changes.
That whole carrot and stick approach, right?
Yeah.
But makes you wonder, were those transitions real? Or were they just doing what they had to do to keep the money coming?
The document brings up that debate among scholars. Was it real progress or just for show? Some say more elections, more active citizens, that's real change. Others are skeptical. They point to stuff like corruption, elections being manipulated.
Yeah, it's complicated. And then you have all these challenges, poverty, inequality, the legacy of colonialism, all making it harder to build a stable democracy. And the document goes deep on one challenge specifically: opposition politics in Africa.
Right, you need a strong opposition to hold the government accountable, offer different ideas. But the document shows how opposition parties often have it really tough.
Like, they don't have the money to compete with the ruling party, who control the funds and the media. And they're often divided. Too many groups with different ideologies or ethnic lines, hard to present a united front.
Like trying to fight with one hand tied behind your back. And the document talks about personalistic parties built around one charismatic leader.
Effective in the short term, maybe. But what happens when that leader is gone? You haven't built anything lasting. The document says opposition parties need to connect with people, build real support, not just rely on a few big figures.
It's about tapping into those grassroots movements, unions, all those voices that make a real democracy. And then there's the ethnicity issue, which the document doesn't shy away from.
It's tricky, right? Ethnic identity can be powerful, but it can also be used to divide people and even lead to violence. The document encourages opposition parties to build coalitions across ethnic lines, focus on what unites them, not what divides them.
Find that common ground, show that democracy can work for everyone, no matter their background. But there are some positive trends in opposition politics, too. The document highlights those.
Like more and more, they're willing to challenge election results in court, using the legal system to hold leaders accountable. And technology, especially social media, is changing the game.
Oh, yeah. It lets opposition groups bypass the state-controlled media, talk directly to people, spread their message, get people involved. Of course, there's downsides to social media, too. Echo chambers, fake news, all that. But it's definitely having an impact.
So what's the future of democracy in Africa? The document doesn't give a simple answer, but it recognizes both the challenges and the reasons to be hopeful.
There have been setbacks, for sure. But the document talks about how resilient African people are, their desire for freedom, for a better future. More and more people understand democratic principles, and they're willing to hold their leaders accountable.
It's a journey, not a destination, right?
Yeah.
It takes constant work, being watchful, and believing in the power of everyone working together to build a fairer society.
Now, switching gears a bit, the document also looks at regional economic communities in Africa. These groups trying to bring countries together to cooperate on economics and politics.
Adds a whole other layer of complexity, huh? All these different groups, each with their own history and goals, trying to figure out how to integrate. The document walks us through some of the key players.
Starts with the Arab-Maghreb Union up in North Africa. They've got those historical tensions, border disputes, but still trying to work together. Then there's ECOWAS in West Africa, more established, active in promoting trade and peacekeeping.
And the document highlights the Central African Customs and Economic Union, trying to overcome economic hurdles and promote stability in their region. Then down south, you've got COMESA, this huge bloc with almost 24 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa aiming for a free trade area.
And finally, there's SADC, focused on economic integration and development in Southern Africa. Big role in peace and security there. But the document doesn't sugarcoat things. It gets into the challenges these organizations face.
Yeah, like putting those big ideas into practice. Talking about cooperation is one thing, but overcoming rivalries and economic differences between countries, that's a whole other story.
And conflict just throws everything off. Civil wars, border disputes, terrorism, it all disrupts trade, makes things unstable, and makes it hard to trust each other and work together.
The document really stresses that peace and security are essential for regional integration to work. Can't build a strong economic bloc when you're constantly dealing with fighting and instability.
And then there's the whole identity question. How do you create a shared sense of identity across all these diverse nations while still respecting their unique cultures and histories? It's a tough balance.
The document talks about promoting cultural exchange, highlighting shared values, but it also says don't try to force everyone into the same mold. It's about finding that sweet spot where regional unity complements national identities, doesn't erase them.
But remember, in all this talk about regional blocs, the document throws in Muammar Gaddafi's
Oh
perspective.
yeah, Gaddafi, always going against the grain. He saw these regional organizations as getting in the way of a United States of Africa, thought they were creating artificial divisions, slowing down real unity.
He wanted that big leap forward, not these small steps. Makes you think about the long game. What's the best way to say them a truly united and prosperous Africa? Regional building blocks or a more radical approach?
And that's where the document takes us next, the global stage, looking at how globalization is impacting Africa's democracies, which are often still pretty fragile. Lots of tension and debate there.
For sure. Globalization has upsides and downsides for African nations. Opens up markets, makes trade easier, access to new technologies. But it can also create new dependencies, make inequality worse, and weaken a country's control over its own affairs.
The document has some serious concerns about economic domination by powerful countries and institutions. Talks about those structural adjustment programs that lenders often impose, forcing African governments to adopt policies that prioritize paying back debt over taking care of their people.
Like being stuck in a debt trap, struggling to stay afloat while others call the shots. And the document says this can really hurt democracy. When you're beholden to outside forces, it's hard to make decisions that truly reflect what your citizens want.
It's a reminder that democracy isn't just about holding elections. It's about having the power to choose your own path, to make decisions that benefit your people, not just foreign investors or creditors.
And the document drives that point home with this powerful quote: "A borderless world is most unlikely to be a democratic one."
Wow, that's heavy. Basically saying globalization might break down physical barriers, but it doesn't level the playing field. It can actually make those power imbalances worse and make it harder for African nations to stand on their own 2 feet and decide their own future.
And that brings us to the core of it, right? Understanding what's shaped Africa since colonialism ended, both from within and outside. The document dives into that history, the good and the bad, in Africa's struggle for political and economic freedom.
Yeah.
Takes us through those waves of military coups that happened after independence, often driven by power grabs, ethnic tensions, and civilian governments failing to keep their promises.
It's a sobering reminder that going from colony to independent nation wasn't always smooth sailing. There were missteps, wrong turns, and brutal regimes that caused a lot of suffering.
For sure. But the document doesn't just focus on the negative. It highlights the resilience of African people, their strength in the face of hardship, their determination to create a better future.
Talks about those grassroots movements that challenged authoritarian rule, those brave activists who fought for freedom and justice, ordinary people who never lost hope for a more equitable and democratic society.
It's a testament to the human spirit, the belief that change is possible, that even in the darkest times, there's a spark of hope, of resistance that can't be extinguished.
Powerful stuff. It's a reminder that the fight for political change in Africa isn't over. It's a continent on the move, full of energy, resilience, and a constant push for something better. You know, we've talked about how tough those transitions to democracy can be, but the document doesn't stop there. It really digs into what happens after. Like, do things actually get better? Does that dream of democracy become reality?
It's so important to look past those first moments of change, the excitement of getting rid of a dictator or having that first election. The document's big on this. Building a democracy, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It needs constant work, constant attention.
It's not enough to just swap out the leaders. You got to change the whole system, right? The document talks about needing strong institutions, people actively participating, and dealing with those deep-rooted problems like poverty and inequality, that can really mess things up.
Exactly. And there's this debate among scholars, like how much progress has there really been? Some are optimistic, saying more elections, a more active civil society, that's democracy taking hold.
Makes sense.
But others are more cautious, saying a lot of African nations are stuck in this thing the document calls electoral authoritarianism. So they have elections, but it's all rigged for the ruling party. No real accountability. People don't have a real say.
So it's not enough to just look like a democracy with elections and a constitution. Those things have to actually work for the people. They need a voice, and they need to be able to hold their leaders accountable.
That's it. And the document have this interesting point about how we measure democratic progress. It says, don't just count how many countries have elections, look at how many people are actually benefiting from democracy.
So it's not just about quantity, but quality.
Exactly. Are people's rights protected? Do they have access to information, a free press? Can they speak their minds without being afraid? That's what a healthy democracy looks like, one that truly serves its people.
Makes you think.
And while the document says progress has been uneven, it does point to some good examples where democracy has taken root and things have gotten better, more stability, a stronger economy, a better life for people.
It's encouraging to see that even with all the challenges, there's hope. That those seeds of democracy can actually grow into something that makes a real difference. But it doesn't end there.
No, the document stresses that you gotta stay vigilant, keep supporting those democratic institutions, and tackle those root causes of inequality, poverty, and conflict that can derail even the most promising changes.
It's a call to action for African nations and for the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
We all have a stake in this. A strong, democratic Africa benefits everyone.
Absolutely. We need to work together to create a world where everyone has a chance to live with dignity, freedom, and peace.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the forces shaping political change in Africa. It's been quite a journey, lots of ups and downs, moments of hope, and moments that make you question everything.
I think what this document really shows is that Africa's story is far from over. It's a dynamic continent full of resilience, always pushing for a better future.
And as we wrap up, I hope you, the listener, are left with a sense of not just how much has happened, but how much is still happening. The story of African politics is still being written.
And we can all be a part of that story.
Exactly. Change is constant, progress isn't guaranteed, and it takes all of us, whether we're in Africa or watching from afar, to create a future that reflects the hopes and dreams of all Africans. So keep learning, keep asking questions, keep engaging. The more we understand about what's happening, the better equipped we'll be to make a difference.